didn't lower his voice when he said it. "She's moving in." Jameson stood in the doorway with a pregnant girl at his side, her hand resting on his arm like she belonged there. The room was not empty. His mother saw. The neighbors passing by saw enough. Isla didn't argue. Didn't ask why. She looked at the girl, then at him, and nodded once. Okay. Then she walked past them, opened the closet, and pulled out his suitcase. By the time he realized what she meant, the house had already decided who it belonged to. If you've ever seen silence speak louder than humiliation, stay with this story. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if you believe dignity doesn't need to shout to be heard, consider subscribing, because some stories don't begin with revenge, but they do end with truth. The house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in Westfield, New Jersey, where lawns were trimmed into careful symmetry, and nothing loud ever lasted long. It was the kind of neighborhood where people noticed things, but pretended they hadn't. That evening, the front door had stayed open a few seconds longer than it should have. Long enough for Evelyn Brooks to see her son standing there with another woman. Long enough for Mrs. Carter next door to pause mid-step with her grocery bags and look twice. Long enough for Isla to understand that whatever Jameson had decided, he had not chosen discretion. Lila Carter shifted her weight slightly, one hand resting protectively over the small curve of her stomach. She looked tired, the kind of tired that came from more than just pregnancy. Her eyes moved between Jameson and Isla, searching for cues for confirmation that this was unfolding the way she had been told it would. Jameson didn't hesitate. He never did when he believed he was in control. "She'll be staying here," he said again, more firmly this time, as if repetition could make it law. "We've already talked about this." They hadn't. Isla stood a few feet away, her posture straight, but not rigid, her hands loosely folded in front of her. She didn't look at Evelyn. She didn't look at the neighbors. She kept her attention where it belonged. On Jameson. "When did you decide that?" she asked. Her voice was even not raised, not sharp. It didn't sound like a challenge. It sounded like documentation. Jameson frowned slightly, caught off guard not by the question itself, but by the tone. There was no emotion to push against, no anger to dismiss. "It's been coming for a while," he said. "You just didn't want to see it." Isla considered that for a moment, as if she were weighing the phrasing rather than the meaning. "And did you inform anyone legally?" she asked. The word legally landed differently. Lila's hand stilled on her stomach. Evelyn, standing just inside the hallway, shifted her purse from one arm to the other. "Isla," she said carefully, her voice carrying the quiet tension of someone trying to contain a situation before it spilled further. "Maybe we should all sit down." No, Jameson cut in. "There's nothing to sit down about. I've made my decision." He stepped fully into the house, guiding Lila gently forward. It was a practiced motion, protective, almost rehearsed. Lila followed, though more slowly now, her eyes lingering on Isla's face. Isla didn't move to block them. She stepped aside. The small act created space, but not permission. Lila noticed it. She couldn't have explained why, but something about the way Isla moved, calm, precise, unhurried, didn't match the version of events she had been given. Jameson exhaled as if relieved. "Thank you," he said, misreading the gesture. "This doesn't have to be complicated." Isla didn't respond to that. Instead, she asked, "Are you still using the joint account for your expenses?" Jameson blinked. "What?" "The account ending in 4,821, she clarified. "Are you still using it?" "That's not what this is about," he said quickly. "It is," Isla said. Not louder, not sharper, just exact. Evelyn looked between them now, her brows pulling together. "Jameson, it's just temporary," he said, the words coming faster now. "Until things are sorted out." "Things," Isla repeated. She let the word sit there, not mocking, not correcting, just placing it back in front of him. Lila's gaze shifted again, this time more noticeably. "You said you were already separated," she said quietly, almost to herself. Jameson turned to her, his expression tightening for a fraction of a second before smoothing out. "We are," he said. "Emotionally, we've been done for months." Isla watched that exchange without interrupting. Then she asked, "Are you still listed as my spouse on the insurance policy?" Jameson's jaw set. Isla stopped. "Are you?" she repeated. Evelyn's voice came softer this time. Jameson answered her. There was a brief silence. "Yes," he said finally. "Because we haven't finalized anything yet," Isla said. It wasn't agreement. It wasn't disagreement. It was acknowledgement. She turned then, not toward the stairs, not toward the kitchen, but toward the small console table near the wall. Her phone lay there, screen dark. Beside it, a neat stack of mail unopened. She picked up none of it. Instead, she walked past Jameson and Lila, her shoulder brushing neither of them, and continued down the hallway toward the bedroom. Jameson let out a short, frustrated breath. "Where are you going to get your suitcase?" she said. He laughed once, disbelieving. "That's not necessary." "It is," she replied. There was no edge in her voice, no sarcasm, just the same quiet certainty that had been there since he walked through the door. Lila turned slightly to watch Isla disappear down the hallway. The house felt different now that she was inside it. Not welcoming, not hostile either, just defined. As if everything in it already knew where it belonged. Evelyn stepped closer to her son, lowering her voice. "Jameson, this isn't how you handle things." "I am handling it," he said. "She's overreacting." Evelyn didn't answer right away. Her eyes moved toward the hallway where Isla had gone. "She's not reacting at all," she said finally. That was the problem. A few minutes later, Isla returned with a medium-sized suitcase. It wasn't overfilled. It wasn't hastily packed. The zipper was closed neatly, the handle extended. She set it down near the door. Jameson stared at it. "You're being dramatic." "No," Isla said. "I'm being clear." She met his eyes then fully for the first time since he had spoken those 4 words at the door. "She's moving in," she said, echoing him. He nodded almost defensively. "Yes." Isla gave a small, almost imperceptible nod in return. "Then you're moving out." The sentence didn't rise. It didn't fall. It settled. Lila's breath caught just slightly. Jameson scoffed. "You don't get to decide that. This is my house, too." Isla didn't argue. She didn't list the documents she'd already reviewed. Didn't mention the down payment that had come from an account he had never contributed to. Didn't bring up the trust structure he had signed without reading. Not yet. Instead, she said, "You should take everything you'll need tonight." Jameson shook his head, pacing once across the room. "You're unbelievable." "After everything, yes," Isla said. He stopped. She hadn't raised her voice. But something in the way she said it, flat, complete, cut through the rest of his sentence. After everything, she repeated, "You should take everything you'll need." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, as if something had just clicked into place. Lila looked down at her hand on her stomach, then back at Jameson. "You said this would be simple," she whispered. It is, he insisted, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "She's just making a scene." Isla glanced toward the open door, where the evening light had started to fade. "I'm not," she said. And she wasn't. There was no scene, no shouting, no tears. Just a suitcase by the door. A set of questions that hadn't been answered the way he expected, and a house that quietly had already begun to separate what was his from what never had been. Isla stepped back, giving them space again. Not as a gesture of surrender, but as the first clean line in a process that had already started long before Jameson brought someone else to stand in her doorway. Long before Jameson brought Lila Carter to the door, Isla had already stopped asking certain questions out loud, not because she didn't notice, but because she had learned exactly where answers tended to go when they were inconvenient. They disappeared into tone, into deflection, into charm that sounded convincing enough to anyone who didn't track details. Isla tracked details. In the early years of their marriage, that habit had been described as diligence, then as helpfulness, eventually as something closer to rigidity, at least in Jameson's version of events. He preferred broader strokes, bigger narratives. He liked saying things like, "I'll take care of it," even when he hadn't read the document, opened the statement, or checked the terms. Isla never corrected him in public. She simply made sure things were in fact taken care of. The mortgage payments had never been late. The property taxes had never gone unpaid. The insurance policies, health, home, auto, had always been current, properly filed, quietly renewed. Jameson signed where he was told to sign. He didn't notice that the signatures always came after Isla had already read every line. At first, it had felt like partnership. Over time, it became something else. A division so clean, it no longer needed to be discussed. He handled appearances. She handled reality. There had been small moments scattered across the years where the imbalance surfaced just enough to be seen. A missed payment that Isla caught before it processed. A business expense that didn't align with any meeting he had mentioned. A weekend trip that appeared on a statement but never in conversation. Each time, Isla had asked, not accusingly, not emotionally, just clearly. Each time, Jameson had answered, not always directly, but smoothly enough. Client dinner, last-minute meeting. You know how things come up. And for a while, that had been enough. Not because Isla believed every word, but because she was still measuring something else. Pattern. It was never one transaction, never one late night, never one unexplained charge. It was the repetition, the way the same explanations appeared in slightly different forms, the way timelines almost aligned, but not quite, the way details blurred at the edges when she asked for specifics. That was when Isla stopped asking in real time. Instead, she started recording. Not in a way anyone else would notice. There was no confrontation, no demand for passwords, no sudden shift in behavior that might have warned him. She simply adjusted. When Jameson left his phone on the counter, she didn't pick it up. But when a notification lit the screen, she remembered the name. When a charge appeared on the credit card, she didn't question it immediately. She waited, then cross-referenced it later. When he mentioned a business trip, she noted the dates, then compared them to the timestamps on transactions that didn't belong in that city. It wasn't suspicion. It was verification. And over time, the gaps widened. There had been a hotel charge in Philadelphia on a night he claimed to be in Boston. A restaurant bill for two at a place they had never visited together. A rideshare receipt that ended at an address Isla didn't recognize, but one she would later come to know too well. She didn't confront him then. Not because she was afraid of the answer, but because she was no longer looking for one. She was building a record. By the time Lila Carter entered the story, Isla already knew there was someone. She didn't know the name at first, or the details, but she knew enough. Enough to recognize that Jameson had crossed from ambiguity into something structured, something sustained. The first time she saw Lila's name clearly, it wasn't in a message thread. It was in a payment, a medical clinic charge. Routine at a glance. But the location didn't match any of their providers. The timing didn't match any appointment Isla had scheduled. She had stared at it for a moment longer than usual. Then she had saved the statement. Not flagged, not highlighted, just stored. Weeks later, another charge appeared. Same clinic, different amount. This time, Isla searched the provider. Prenatal services. She didn't react outwardly. She closed the tab, set her phone down, continued with her day. That was the moment the last uncertainty disappeared, not replaced by anger, by clarity. From that point forward, everything Jameson said passed through a different filter, not one that asked, "Is this true?" but one that asked, "How does this fit?" The late nights became data points. The unexplained absences became entries in a timeline. The softened tone when he spoke about work stress became a pattern she could map. She didn't withdraw, not visibly. She still attended dinners, still responded when spoken to, still moved through the house in the same measured way. But internally, something had already shifted. She stopped filling in the gaps for him, stopped assuming intent where there was only convenience, stopped protecting a version of the marriage that no longer matched the facts. Instead, she began preparing for what came after. It started with documents, always documents. The house, for instance. Jameson spoke about it as if it were theirs in the most equal sense of the word, as if ownership were implied by presence. But Isla remembered the process differently. The down payment had come from an account her parents had set up years before, a trust structured carefully with restrictions Jameson had never fully read. At the time, he had waved it off. "Whatever makes it easier," he had said, signing where indicated. Isla had kept a copy of every version, every draft, every revision, every email from Daniel Reeves, the attorney who had handled the transaction. She didn't revisit them immediately, not until the pattern had become undeniable. Then, one evening, while Jameson was out, another late meeting, she opened the files again. Not searching, confirming. The language was clear. The initial capital contribution, the source of funds, the designation of ownership. Jameson's name appeared where it needed to for the mortgage, but not where it mattered most. Isla closed the document without lingering. She didn't feel vindicated, only certain. After that, the process became more deliberate. She downloaded full bank statements, not just summaries. Saved them in folders labeled by month. She backed up emails to a secure drive, not because she expected anything to disappear, but because she understood that clarity required preservation. She reviewed the insurance policies, noting that Jameson was still listed as her spouse. That benefits still extended both ways. She didn't change it, not yet. Timing mattered. Everything had a sequence. By the time Jameson stood in the doorway with Laya, Isla had already completed most of what she needed to begin the next phase. The questions she asked that night weren't spontaneous. They were selected, placed carefully in front of witnesses without accusation, not to expose him immediately, but to establish a record of what he said, of what he believed, of what he assumed he could claim without consequence. Jameson, for all his confidence, had never understood the difference between being persuasive and being correct. Isla understood it completely, and she knew something else he didn't. That a marriage doesn't end at the moment of betrayal. It ends at the moment one person stops compensating for the other's choices. That moment had already passed. Quietly, weeks ago. Everything that followed the suitcase, the questions, the shift in the room wasn't the beginning. It was the first visible sign that the structure he had relied on no longer existed. And unlike him, Isla didn't need to raise her voice to make that clear. Lila Carter had imagined this moment differently. Not in dramatic detail, not in the way people rehearse arguments or anticipate conflict. But she had believed with a quiet certainty that when the door opened, there would be a shift. A recognition. Something that confirmed she was stepping into a place already waiting for her. Instead, she stepped into something already defined. The house did not feel empty. It did not feel abandoned. It did not feel like a life that had ended. It felt intact. That was the first thing she noticed, though she could not yet explain why it unsettled her. The second was Isla. Not her appearance, not her posture, but her stillness. Lila had expected anger, or grief, or at least resistance. She had prepared herself for it in small defensive ways, reminding herself that she hadn't meant for things to overlap, that Jameson had said it was already over, that sometimes life simply unfolded in inconvenient sequences. But Isla had given her none of that. No accusation, no hostility, not even dismissal. Just space. It was harder to stand in. Lila remained near the doorway for a few moments after Jameson moved further into the house, her hand still resting lightly on her stomach. She felt suddenly aware of herself in a way she hadn't before, of the shoes she wore, of the way her coat hung slightly open, of the fact that she did not know where to put her bag. Jameson turned back toward her. "You can come in," he said, his voice softening. "You're fine, fine." The word didn't settle. Still, she stepped forward. The living room was clean, but not in a staged or impersonal way. There were books on the shelves that looked read, not arranged. A throw blanket folded neatly on the couch. A glass of water on the side table, half-wide full, as if someone had intended to return to it. Lila's eyes moved over these details without meaning to. This was not a place someone had already left. Behind her, the front door clicked shut. The sound seemed louder than it should have been. Jameson exhaled again, as though the hardest part was over. "We'll figure out the rest," he said. "This is just logistics. Lila nodded, though the word didn't match what she was feeling. From the hallway, she could hear the faint sound of movement, drawers opening, then closing. Not hurried, not chaotic, measured. She glanced toward the sound. "Is she?" Lila began. "Packing," Jameson said quickly. "She's being dramatic about it." But there was something in his tone that didn't fully support the claim. Lila didn't respond. Instead, she moved a few steps further into the room, lowering herself carefully onto the edge of the couch. Her body felt heavier than usual, not just from the pregnancy, but from a growing awareness she hadn't expected to carry. Evelyn remained near the hallway, her expression composed but distant, as if she were watching something unfold that she could no longer influence. "This should have been handled differently," she said quietly. Jameson ran a hand through his hair. "It's being handled now." Evelyn didn't argue. She simply looked at him for a moment longer than necessary, then turned her attention toward the hallway. When Isla returned, the shift in the room was immediate, though subtle. She carried the suitcase with one hand, not dragging it, not struggling. It was balance prepared. Not an emotional gesture, but a completed task. She set it down near the door. Lila watched the movement closely. There was no hesitation in it, no question. Isla wasn't reacting to what had just happened. She was continuing something that had already begun. That realization settled somewhere deep in Lila's chest. Jameson's voice broke the silence. "You don't have to do that." Isla looked at him briefly. "I know." Then her gaze moved just slightly toward Lila. It wasn't confrontational. It wasn't welcoming either. It was acknowledgement. Lila felt it more than she could interpret it. "Hi," Lila said the word, leaving her before she had fully decided to speak. Isla nodded once. "Lila." It wasn't a question. Lila's brows drew together faintly. "You know my name?" "Yes," Isla said. She didn't elaborate. She didn't say how. The absence of explanation said more. Lila shifted slightly on the couch, her hand tightening unconsciously over her stomach. "Jameson told me she started, then stopped. Told me what the sentence didn't complete itself." Isla didn't press. She turned instead toward a small cabinet near the kitchen entrance, opening it and taking out a glass. She filled it with water and placed it on the coffee table in front of Lila. "You should stay hydrated," she said. The gesture was simple, practical, unemotional. That made it harder to receive. "Thank you." Lila said, her voice quieter now. Jameson watched the exchange with visible discomfort. "We don't need to do this," he said. "Let's not pretend no one is pretending," Isla replied. Again, not sharp, just accurate. Jameson opened his mouth, then closed it. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched, but it didn't feel empty. It felt structured, as if each person in the room was being given time to understand something they hadn't expected to face. Lila looked down at the glass of water, then back up at Isla. "You said something earlier," she said slowly, "about legal things." Isla met her gaze. "I asked him if he had informed anyone. Legally," she clarified. "Why does that matter?" Lila asked. It wasn't defensive. It was genuine. Isla considered her for a moment before answering. "Because decisions that affect property, financial obligations, and legal status don't change because someone says they do," she said. "They change when they're documented." Lila absorbed that. Jameson exhaled sharply. "This is exactly what I mean," he said. "She's turning everything into a transaction." Isla didn't respond to him. Lila did. "That doesn't sound like a transaction," she said quietly. Jameson looked at her, surprised. Lila didn't hold his gaze for long. Instead, she looked around the room again, this time more carefully. The photos on the wall, subtle, not staged, showed years of a life she had not been part of. Holidays, trips, ordinary days captured without performance. None of them looked recent, but none of them looked erased either. "You told me it was over." Lila said, her voice softer now, but more grounded. "It is," Jameson insisted. Lila nodded slightly, but her expression didn't fully align with the agreement. "Then why are things still like this?" she asked, gesturing faintly around the room. Jameson didn't answer immediately. Because there wasn't a simple answer, not one that aligned with everything he had said before. Isla watched the exchange without interruption. She didn't step in to clarify, didn't offer additional information, didn't correct him. She didn't need to. The room was already doing that. After a moment, she turned back toward the hallway. "There are a few more things in the closet you might want," she said to Jameson. "If you need them tonight." He shook his head, frustration building again. "I'm not leaving like this." Isla paused, then looked at him once more. "You already did," she said. Not referring to the suitcase, not referring to the door, but to something earlier, something less visible. Jameson didn't respond, because for the first time since he arrived, he wasn't entirely sure what he was responding to. Lila felt it too. The shift. Not loud, not sudden, but undeniable. She had entered the house believing she was stepping into a space that had been cleared. Now sitting on the edge of the couch with a glass of water she hadn't touched, she began to understand that she had walked into something far more complex, something already in motion. And for the first time, she wasn't certain where she stood within it. After the door closed behind Jameson, and the quiet tension of the evening dissolved into distance, the house did not feel emptier. It felt resolved. Not peaceful, not yet, but settled in a way that came only when something long unstable had finally stopped pretending to hold. Isla stood for a moment in the hallway listening. Not for footsteps, not for voices, for absence. When she was certain the house had returned to itself, she turned and walked toward the study. It was a small room, often overlooked by guests, positioned just off the main living area. There was no decoration meant to impress. Only a desk, a filing cabinet, and shelves lined with folders labeled in a handwriting that did not waver. This was where things were kept in their correct form. Isla closed the door behind her, not out of secrecy, but out of habit. She sat down, reached for her laptop, and opened it without hesitation. There was no pause to gather emotion, only sequence. The first file she opened was the property folder, not the simplified version stored for quick reference, but the complete set, the one she had compiled herself over the years, with every attachment, every revision, every communication preserved in chronological order. The purchase agreement appeared on the screen clean and unchanged. Date, parties, terms. Her eyes moved over the lines, not to rediscover them, but to confirm that nothing had shifted in the way documents sometimes seem to shift when circumstances changed. They hadn't. She clicked into the attached correspondence. An email thread with Daniel Reeves, the real estate attorney who had handled the transaction. The subject line remained simple. Final closing documents review required. She scrolled. There it was, the paragraph she had reread more than once over the past weeks, though never in the presence of anyone else. The initial capital contribution. Source: the Carter Family Trust, structured under Isla's name prior to marriage. Language specifying its classification. Separate property, protected, not subject to reallocation without explicit legal modification. Jameson had signed that document. She remembered the moment. He had skimmed the first page, glanced at the numbers, then leaned back in his chair. As long as it goes through, he had said. It had. Isla closed the file without lingering. There was no satisfaction in being correct, only clarity in knowing what had always been true. Next, she opened the bank statements. Not summaries, full records, line by line, month by month. She didn't search randomly. She knew where to look. The account ending in 4,821. The one still active, still quietly linked to obligations Jameson had continued to assume were his to use. She selected a statement from 3 months prior. Scrolled. There. A transfer. Small enough not to raise immediate suspicion. Frequent enough to form a pattern. Recipient a name she now recognized. Lila Carter. Not labeled as such, of course. Just an account number. But Isla had already traced it. Cross-referenced it. Verified it against another record. A medical billing entry tied to the same routing information. She didn't need to guess. She opened another statement. Then another. The pattern held. Not reckless, not extravagant. Careful. That was what made it more revealing. Jameson hadn't been acting impulsively. He had been maintaining something, supporting it, sustaining it over time. Isla highlighted nothing, marked nothing. She simply saved copies to a separate folder labeled with a date. Documentation did not require emphasis. It required preservation. She moved on. Credit card activity. Again, not looking for anomalies. Confirming structure. Restaurants in cities he claimed not to visit. Rideshare charges that began at locations inconsistent with his explanations. A hotel charge that overlapped with a conference that had never appeared in any official schedule. Each entry was a piece, not of betrayal, that had already been established, but of consistency, of choice. She compiled them quietly, exporting files, organizing them into categories that would make sense, not just to her, but to someone else reviewing them without context. Because eventually someone would. A judge, an attorney, a system that did not care about intention, only evidence. When she finished with the financial records, she leaned back slightly, allowing her eyes to rest for the first time since she had sat down. Not in exhaustion, in transition. The next step required a different kind of attention. She opened her email, typed a name into the search bar. Daniel Reeves. The correspondence populated immediately. Professional, structured, predictable. She clicked into a recent message. Unsent. A draft she had started days earlier, then closed before completing. She read it again. Then, without editing the existing text, she began a new message. Clear, direct. No unnecessary detail. Daniel. I would like to formally review my current property and financial standing in preparation for legal separation proceedings. I have compiled documentation regarding asset ownership account activity and relevant communications. Please advise on next steps and availability for consultation. She paused only long enough to reread it once, not for tone, for accuracy. Then she attached the first set of files. Not all of them, not yet. Just enough to establish scope. She clicked send. The message left her outbox without ceremony. No confirmation beyond the small visual shift on the screen. Isla closed her email. For a moment the room was still again. The kind of stillness that came not from uncertainty, but from movement completed. She stood crossing the space to the filing cabinet, opened the top drawer. Inside folders arranged with the same precision as her digital files. She selected one labeled Insurance and Beneficiaries, opened it. The documents inside were current, names listed, statuses unchanged. Jameson still appeared where he had always appeared. Spouse, primary. She looked at the page for a few seconds longer than necessary. Not because she was reconsidering, but because she was confirming timing. Then she closed the folder and returned it to its place. Not yet. There was a sequence to follow, a structure to maintain. Changing too much too quickly would not strengthen her position. It would complicate it. Everything had to move in alignment. Step by step, outside the study, the house remained quiet. No raised voices, no sudden returns. Only the faint, distant hum of a neighborhood settling into night. Isla turned off the desk lamp, leaving the room in shadow. Then she stepped back into the hallway. Nothing had visibly changed. The furniture remained where it was. The air felt the same. But something fundamental had shifted. Not in the house, in the record. In what could now be shown, proven established, without interpretation. Jameson had believed that what mattered was what he said, what he declared, what he insisted into being through confidence and repetition. Isla knew differently. What mattered was what remained when words were removed. What was written, what was signed, what was traceable. Paper did not forget. And unlike memory, it did not adjust itself to make things easier to carry. It held, exactly, as it had from the beginning. The invitation had been sent days before Jameson brought Lila to the house. A standing Sunday dinner at Evelyn Brooks's home, unchanged for years, predictable in its timing, its menu, its quiet expectations. It was the kind of gathering that existed less for celebration and more for continuity. A place where things were meant to appear intact. Jameson hadn't canceled. That in itself had already been a decision. Isla arrived on time. She did not arrive with him. The driveway was already partially full when she pulled in. Evelyn's car, of course. Ryan Brooks's black sedan parked slightly off to the side. A familiar arrangement. A familiar structure. Nothing about it suggested that anything had shifted. Inside the house smelled faintly of rosemary and roasted chicken. The table had been set with care-cloth pressed silverware, aligned glasses placed precisely where they had always been. Evelyn stood near the kitchen entrance, her posture composed, though her eyes moved quickly when Isla stepped inside. "You came," she said. It wasn't surprise. It was something closer to assessment. "I was invited," Isla replied. Evelyn nodded once as if that answered more than the words themselves. "Jameson is running late," she said. Isla placed her bag near the chair she had occupied for years. "Of course," she said. Ryan Brooks entered from the back hallway. Sleeves rolled slightly, his expression neutral, in a way that suggested he had already heard enough to know something was wrong, but not enough to know what to say about it. "Isla," he greeted. "Ryan." No one mentioned Lila. Not yet. They sat. The conversation began, as it always did, surface-level polite, anchored in topics that required no emotional investment. Work updates, weather shifts, a passing mention of a neighbor moving away. Isla participated where appropriate, answered when spoken to. She did not offer more than necessary. Time passed, not quickly but steadily. By the time the front door finally opened, the table was already set, the first course prepared, the rhythm established. Jameson entered with Lila beside him. The room did not freeze, it adjusted. Evelyn turned first, her expression carefully composed. Ryan followed, his gaze sharper, more direct. Lila hesitated at the threshold, her hand briefly tightening around the strap of her bag before she stepped inside. "This is Lila," Jameson said, as if introductions alone could define the situation. Lila offered a small, uncertain smile. "Hi." No one responded immediately, not out of rudeness, but because the moment required recalibration. Evelyn moved first. "You should sit," she said, her tone neutral. "Dinner is ready." It was not a welcome. It was not a rejection. It was structure. Lila nodded, grateful for the direction, and moved toward the table. Jameson followed, pulling out a chair as if the gesture could restore normalcy. Isla watched the movement without reacting. When Lila sat, it was not in Isla's usual place, but close enough that the distinction mattered. Dinner began. Plates passed, utensils lifted, conversations resumed. For a few minutes, the illusion held. Jameson spoke more than usual, filling the space with commentary that required no response. Work anecdotes, casual observations, anything that might keep the focus away from what had already been made visible. Lila spoke little. She ate slowly, her posture careful, her attention divided between the food and the subtle currents moving through the room. Isla waited, not for silence, for the moment when the conversation could no longer sustain itself. It came sooner than expected. Ryan set his fork down. So he set his tone even. "How long has this been going on?" The question was not directed at anyone in particular, but everyone knew who it was for. Jameson exhaled through his nose. "It's not what it looks like," he said. Ryan didn't respond. He didn't need to. The table held the question in place. Jameson shifted slightly in his seat. "Lila and I, this isn't new," he said. "It's been developing for a while. While you were married," Ryan clarified. Jameson's jaw tightened. "We've been done for a long time," he said. Isla lifted her glass, taking a small sip of water. Then she set it down. "Are you still using the joint account for your expenses?" she asked. The question entered the conversation without force, but it changed its direction entirely. Jameson looked at her. "Isla, the account ending in 4,821, she continued. "Are you still using it?" Evelyn's gaze shifted to her son. Ryan's expression didn't change, but his attention sharpened. Jameson leaned back slightly. "That's not relevant right now." "It is," Isla said. Again, not louder, just placed. Lila's fork paused midway to her plate. "Why?" she asked quietly. Isla turned her head slightly toward her. "Because that account is tied to obligations that have not been legally adjusted," she said. Jameson let out a short laugh. "You're making this into something it's not." Isla didn't look at him. She asked, "Are you still listed as my spouse on the insurance policy?" The table stilled. Not dramatically, but completely. Evelyn's hand tightened slightly around her glass. Ryan's eyes moved between them. Jameson's expression shifted irritation, giving way to something less controlled. "We haven't finalized anything yet," he said. "So yes," Isla replied. It wasn't a correction. It was a confirmation. Lila looked at Jameson. "You said everything was already separated," she said. "It is," he insisted. "This is just paperwork." "Paperwork defines separation," Isla said. The sentence did not carry emphasis. It didn't need to. Ryan leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "You told her the house was yours," he said to Jameson. Jameson glanced at him. "It is mine." "Then why is her name on the primary documentation?" Ryan asked. Jameson froze, not visibly, but in the small delay before he responded. "That's just how it was structured," he said. Evelyn spoke then, her voice quieter than before. Structured how Jameson didn't answer immediately. Because he didn't know. Not precisely. He had signed the documents. He had attended the closing. He had walked through the house as if ownership followed presence. But the details, those, had always belonged to Isla. At the table, that absence became visible. Lila shifted in her seat, her hand moving again to her stomach. "You said it was simple," she said. Jameson turned to her, his voice tightening. "It is simple. She's complicating it." No one at the table agreed. Not aloud. But the silence changed. Isla reached for her napkin, adjusting it slightly beside her plate. She had not raised her voice, had not accused, had not presented evidence. She had only asked questions, and the answers, such as they were, had begun to arrange themselves. Ryan picked up his glass. "You should get clarity on that," he said to Jameson, "before you make claims like that in front of people." Jameson didn't respond, because for the first time, the room was no longer moving with him. Evelyn looked down at her plate, then back up at Isla. There was something new in her expression, not alignment, but recognition. The conversation resumed, but not in the same way. The rhythm had been altered. What had once been assumed now required verification. What had once been said without question now lingered, waiting to be checked. Lila said very little after that. She listened, not just to the words, but to the spaces between them. And in those spaces, something began to take shape. Not yet complete, not yet fully understood, but no longer aligned with what she had been told. Across the table, Isla remained composed. She did not press further. She did not need to. The first crack had already appeared, and once something like that formed in public in front of witnesses in a space designed to hold things together, it did not close easily. Not with words, not with insistence, only with truth. And truth, once introduced, did not leave quietly. The dinner ended without resolution. No raised voices, no declarations. No one leaving the table abruptly. But something had shifted in a way that did not require acknowledgement. Lila felt it most clearly, not in what had been said, but in what had not been answered. The drive back was quiet. Jameson insisted on taking her home first, even though it meant circling back later. He framed it as consideration, as if the gesture itself could smooth over what had just unfolded. "You don't need to think too much about tonight," he said as he pulled onto the road. "My family just doesn't handle change well." Lila looked out the window. Streetlights passed in steady intervals, casting brief, repeating shadows across the dashboard. "That didn't feel like confusion," she said. Jameson tightened his grip on the wheel slightly. "What do you mean? They weren't confused," she said. "They were listening." To her, he said quickly. Lila didn't respond immediately, because that wasn't entirely accurate. They hadn't been listening to Isla. They had been listening to him, and noticing where his answers didn't hold. "You said everything was already separated," Lila said after a moment. "It is," Jameson replied. "In every way that matters." Lila turned her head slightly, studying his profile. "What way is that?" she asked. Jameson exhaled. "Emotionally, practically. We haven't been a real couple for a long time." "That's not what she asked," Lila said. Jameson didn't answer, because he couldn't reframe that part as easily. They drove the rest of the way in silence. When he pulled up outside her apartment, he turned to her with a softer expression. I know this isn't how you imagined it, he said. But we'll figure it out. Lila nodded, but the motion felt automatic, not agreement, just completion of the moment. Okay, she said. But the word didn't carry certainty. She stepped out of the car, closing the door gently behind her. Jameson waited until she had reached the entrance before driving away. Lila stood there for a moment, longer than necessary, her hand resting lightly against the glass door. Then she went inside. The apartment was quiet, smaller than the house she had just left, less structured, more temporary. She set her bag down, then lowered herself carefully onto the couch. For a while, she didn't move. Her thoughts didn't come in clear lines. They circled, returning to the same moments, the same questions. Not what had been said, but how. Isla's voice, calm, even, precise. No hesitation, no need to search for words. That was what unsettled her most, not the content of the questions, the certainty behind them. Lila leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees. You should stay hydrated. The memory surfaced unexpectedly. The glass of water placed in front of her. No judgment, no performance, no attempt to establish superiority, just care. Practical, measured, uninvited. It didn't align with the version of Isla she had been given. Jameson had described her differently. Cold, distant, difficult to live with. Not cruel, but unyielding. Someone who had made the marriage impossible long before anything else had happened. Lila had believed him. Not entirely without question, but enough to proceed. Enough to accept the narrative that she had not disrupted something whole, only stepped into something already broken. Now, sitting alone in her apartment, she found herself replaying the evening through a different lens. If Isla was cold, why had she offered water? If Isla was difficult, why had she not argued? If Isla had already let go, why had nothing been formally changed? The questions didn't accuse. They aligned, slowly, into something that resembled a pattern. Lila reached for her phone. Not to call Jameson. Not yet. She opened her messages instead. Scrolled. There were months of them. Fragments of a relationship built in intervals. Running late tonight. Work's been insane. Wish I could explain everything properly. She had accepted those explanations because they came with attention, with presence when he was there, with promises that felt specific enough to trust. But now, she opened one thread further back. A message from him weeks ago. Just got out of a long meeting. I'll call you when I'm home. She checked the timestamp. Then, almost without thinking, she opened her email and searched for something else. The appointment confirmation, the prenatal clinic, date, time. She stared at the screen. The overlap was exact. At the time, she hadn't questioned it, because there had been no reason to. Now the alignment felt intentional, not coincidence. She leaned back slowly, her hand moving again to rest over her stomach. The baby shifted slightly beneath her palm. A small grounding movement. Something real, unaffected by any of this. Lila closed her eyes for a moment. Not to avoid the thought, but to hold it steady. When she opened them again, she reached for her phone once more. This time, she searched a different term. The address from one of Jameson's rideshare receipts. She had seen it once briefly when he had shown her something else on his phone. She had not meant to remember it, but she had. The search results appeared quickly. A residential listing. A house. In Westfield. The same neighborhood. She stared at the image on the screen, then at the address, then back at the image. There was no doubt. It was the same house. Isla's house. The realization didn't arrive as shock. It arrived as confirmation. Jameson had never described it as shared. He had said my place. He had said where I live. He had never said our house. Lila set the phone down slowly. Her breathing remained steady. But something inside her shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. Enough to create distance between what she had been told and what she was now beginning to see. She stood moving toward the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. The motion felt familiar, echoing something from earlier. She took a sip, then leaned against the counter, her gaze unfocused. She wasn't angry, not yet. What she felt was quieter than that, more precise, a kind of recalibration. She had entered the situation, believing she understood the roles. Who had ended what? Who had stayed too long? Who had moved on? Now those roles no longer aligned. And without that alignment, everything else required reconsideration. Across town, in a house that remained exactly where she had left it, Isla was not thinking about Lila. Not directly. She didn't need to. Because the process she had set in motion did not depend on whether Lila understood. It depended on what could be shown, what could be documented, what would hold when everything else was questioned. Still in the quiet structure of the evening, something else had also been set in motion. Not by Isla, but by the absence of contradiction, by the lack of hostility, by the simple fact that she had not needed to fight to be believed. Lila had begun to listen, not to words, but to consistency. And once someone begins to listen that way, the story they were given no longer remains intact. It separates, piece by piece, until only what is supported remains, and everything else falls away. The office of Daniel Reeves was not designed to impress. It was designed to hold. The building itself stood on a quieter street in downtown Newark, away from the newer glass structures that reflected more than they contained. Inside, the hallways were lined with doors that closed properly, walls that absorbed sound, and shelves that carried the weight of cases no one discussed outside those rooms. Isla arrived 10 minutes early, not out of anxiety, out of habit. She checked in at the front desk, gave her name, and took a seat without looking at her phone. The folder in her hands remained closed. There was no need to review anything again. She already knew what it contained. When Daniel Reeves stepped into the waiting area, he recognized her immediately. "Isla," he said, offering a brief professional nod. "It's been a while." "It has," she replied. He gestured toward his office. "Come in." The room was exactly as she remembered. Orderly, deliberate, with no unnecessary decoration. A desk cleared of clutter. 2 chairs positioned evenly across from it. A cabinet behind him that likely contained more information than anyone outside the room would ever understand. She sat. He didn't begin with pleasantries. "What's changed?" he asked. Isla placed the folder on the desk and opened it. "Circumstances have become defined," she said. Daniel watched her for a moment, then reached for the documents. "Walk me through it," he said. She did. Not from the beginning of the marriage. Not from the moment of suspicion. From the point where facts became structured. She outlined the account activity first. "The joint account ending in 4,821, she said. "It has remained active without modification." Daniel nodded, scanning the first set of statements. "Usage?" he asked. "Consistent," Isla replied. "Transfers have been made to a third-party account over a period of several months." "Personal?" he asked. "Yes." She did not say Lila's name. She didn't need to. Daniel flipped through the pages, his eyes moving quickly but not carelessly. "Amounts are controlled," he observed. "Not large enough to trigger immediate flags," patterned, Isla added. He looked up briefly. "That matters more." He set the statements aside and reached for the next section. "Credit card activity, receipts, locations, dates. Have these been disputed?" he asked. "No." "Good," he said. "We don't dispute yet. We establish first." He continued reading. "Hotel charges, rideshare logs. timestamps that aligned more with each other than with any explanation Jameson had provided. Daniel leaned back slightly, tapping the edge of the document against the desk once before setting it down. "This isn't impulsive behavior," he said. "No," Isla agreed. "It's sustained," he continued, "which means intent can be inferred." He reached for another document. "This," he said, holding up a printed email confirmation. "Medical billing prenatal services," Isla said. Daniel's eyes flickered briefly, not with surprise, but with recognition of complexity. "And the payments?" he asked. "Linked to the same account pattern," Isla replied. He placed the document down carefully. "All right," he said. "That establishes financial movement tied to an undisclosed personal obligation." He didn't soften the phrasing. He didn't dramatize it either. He simply named it. Isla didn't respond. She didn't need to. Daniel turned to the final section she had brought. Property documentation. He scanned the first page, then the second, then paused at the attached correspondence. "I remember this," he said. "The trust structure?" "Yes," Isla replied. He nodded, reading more closely now. "The initial capital came from your family trust," he said. "Clearly documented. Separate property designation is intact." He looked up at her. "Has anything been modified since closing? No. Any refinancing title changes? No." Daniel exhaled slowly, a small shift in posture that signaled a conclusion forming. "Then the foundation is stable," he said. He placed the document back on the desk, aligning it neatly with the others. "Let's be precise," he continued. "He has been operating under the assumption of shared control." "Yes." "He does not have that control," Daniel said. "No. And he has used funds that are traceable to structures he does not fully understand." "Yes." Daniel nodded once. "That gives us leverage," he said. The word did not carry weight in Isla's expression. She did not see it as leverage. She saw it as alignment. Daniel leaned forward slightly, folding his hands. "Have you made any changes yet?" he asked. "No," Isla said. "Not beyond documentation." "Good," he replied. "We don't move prematurely." He reached for a notepad, writing a few brief points. "Next steps," he said. "We formalize." He looked up at her. "Filing for legal separation or divorce will require a full disclosure of assets and liabilities," he explained. "What you've brought here positions you well, but we need to control timing." Isla listened. "Do not alter accounts yet," he continued. "Do not remove access in a way that could be interpreted as concealment." "I understand," she said. "We will notify through proper channels," he said. "That includes financial disclosures, property status, and any misuse of funds." He paused, then added, "We also document his current statements." Isla's gaze remained steady. "He's already made several," she said. "In public?" Daniel asked. "Yes." He nodded. "Good." Again, the word was not emotional. It was procedural. "Statements made in front of witnesses establish expectation," he said. "When those expectations conflict with documented reality, that discrepancy becomes relevant." He set the pen down. "This is not about proving betrayal," he said. "The court does not prioritize that in the way people assume." "I'm aware," Isla replied. "It's about establishing financial clarity and legal standing," he continued. "And in that regard," he gestured lightly to the documents on the desk. "You're prepared." The word settled differently than the others, not as a conclusion, as a recognition of process completed. Isla inclined her head slightly. "Timeline?" she asked. Daniel considered. "We begin with a formal notice," he said. "Then filing. From there, it depends on response." "He will resist," Isla said. "Yes," Daniel agreed. "But resistance without documentation is limited." He leaned back again, his posture returning to its earlier stillness. "You've done what most people don't," he said. "You waited until the facts were complete before acting." Isla did not interpret that as praise. It was simply accurate. Daniel gathered the documents, organizing them into a temporary file. "I'll prepare the initial paperwork," he said. "You'll review before anything is submitted." "Of course." He paused, then added, "One more thing." Isla waited. "More thing. Do not engage in verbal escalation," he said. "If he reaches out, I'll direct him to you," she finished. Daniel nodded. "Exactly." The meeting ended without ceremony. No handshake lingered, no final reassurance offered, only a clear path forward. When Isla stepped back into the hallway, the building felt the same as when she had entered. Contained, structured, unmoved by individual cases, yet built to process them all the same. Outside, the city moved as it always did. Traffic, voices, unrelated lives continuing without awareness of the shift that had just taken place in a quiet office above them. Isla walked to her car without hesitation. There was nothing left to decide, only steps to follow. Back in Westfield, the house remained unchanged in appearance. But like everything else, it now existed within a framework that no longer relied on assumption. Jameson had believed that control came from confidence, from speaking first, from declaring outcomes. But documents did not respond to confidence. They did not adjust to tone. They did not hesitate. Bank records did not flinch. They held, exactly as they were. And now, for the first time, everything he had done within that system was no longer just part of a pattern only Isla could see. It was part of a record that would be seen by others, reviewed, measured, and eventually decided. The message arrived at 2:14 a.m. Isla did not hear it when it came in. Her phone rested face down on the nightstand, its screen lighting briefly in the dark before returning to stillness. The house remained quiet, unchanged by the small shift that had just occurred within it. She saw it in the morning, not immediately. She moved through her routine first, the same measured sequence that had carried her through the past weeks. Coffee, email, a brief review of the documents Daniel had already begun organizing into formal structure. Only then did she turn her phone over. The notification sat near the top of the screen. Unknown number, voicemail. Isla did not assume. She tapped it. The recording began without introduction. Jameson's voice filled the space. Clear, unguarded, shaped by the kind of confidence that only existed when he believed no one else would be listening. "I told you, she's not going to do anything," he was saying. "Isla doesn't make scenes. That's not who she is." A pause. The faint sound of movement in the background fabric shifting, perhaps. A door closing. "She'll go through the motions," he continued. "Ask a few questions, organize her little files. But that's it. She's not the type to blow things up." Another pause. Then quieter, but more certain. "She won't take the house. She wouldn't even know how to start." The message ended. No name, no explanation of who he had meant to send it to. It didn't matter. Isla replayed it once. Not because she needed to hear it again, but to confirm what had already been clear from the first pass. Tone, assumption, expectation. She saved the file, not to her main storage, to the same secured folder she had been building quietly piece by piece. There was no visible reaction, no tightening of expression, no outward shift. Only another entry. Later that day, she reviewed the timeline. Not the emotional one, the factual one. She opened a new document and began mapping dates. Not writing full sentences, just entries. March 12th, credit card charge restaurant in Newark. March 12th, claimed business dinner in Manhattan. April 3rd, hotel, charge Philadelphia April 3rd. Claimed overnight conference in Boston. May 21st, prenatal clinic payment, May 21st voicemail reference to late meeting. Each line aligned with something else. Not perfectly, but consistently enough that the gaps formed their own pattern. The voicemail fit within that pattern. Not as a standalone piece, but as confirmation of mindset, of what Jameson believed would or would not happen. Isla did not annotate the document with interpretation. She didn't need to. The sequence spoke. In the afternoon, she stepped outside. Not to leave, to observe. The neighborhood had returned to its usual rhythm. Cars moving in and out of driveways, a dog being walked along the sidewalk, voices carrying lightly across trimmed lawns. Nothing in the environment reflected what had already shifted beneath it. That was the nature of most changes. They occurred without announcement, without visible markers, until eventually they reached a point where they could no longer be contained within the private spaces that had held them. Isla walked to the edge of the driveway and paused. Across the street, a security camera mounted near a neighbor's garage faced outward at a slight angle. Not directly at her house, but enough to capture portions of the street. She had noticed it before, not recently, months ago. At the time, it had meant nothing. Now it was part of the landscape she was reevaluating. Not everything needed to be pursued, but everything needed to be understood. 2 days later, she returned to Daniel's office. This time, she did not bring a folder, only her phone. Daniel looked up as she entered, his expression unchanged from their previous meeting. "Something new?" he asked. "Yes," Isla said. She sat and placed her phone on the desk. "Voicemail," she added. Daniel reached for it but did not press play immediately. "Context?" he asked. "Unintended recording," Isla replied. "Sent to me by mistake." He nodded, content. "He outlines his assumptions," she said, "regarding my response and the property." Daniel pressed play. He listened without interruption. When it ended, he set the phone down. "He underestimated you," he said. Isla did not respond. Daniel leaned back slightly. "This is useful," he continued, "not because of what it proves directly, but because of what it establishes." He glanced at her. "Intent," he said. "Expectation of non-action. Dismissal of legal structure." He tapped the desk lightly once. "Combined with financial records, it reinforces a pattern." Isla nodded. "That was my assessment." Daniel reached for his notes. "We'll include a reference to this," he said, "not as primary evidence, but as supporting material." He paused. "Do you have anything else tied to timing?" he asked. Isla considered. "Potentially," she said. She described the camera across the street. Daniel listened. "Angle?" he asked. "Partial," Isla replied. "But consistent coverage of entry and exit." He nodded. "Worth exploring," he said. "We can request access if necessary." "Understood." Daniel made a brief note. "Timing matters," he continued. "Not just for establishing presence, but for contradicting statements." He looked at her directly. "The more we align his words with verifiable movement, the stronger the structure becomes." Isla absorbed that. Not as instruction, as confirmation. That evening, Jameson called. For the first time since the dinner. Isla let it ring. Not out of avoidance, out of sequence. When the call ended, a message followed. "We need to talk." She read it, then set the phone down. There was no urgency in her response. Because urgency belonged to a different stage, one she had already moved past. The next morning, another message. "You're taking this too far." Isla did not reply. She opened her email instead, forwarded the message to Daniel. No commentary, no interpretation, just inclusion. By the end of the week, the timeline had expanded. Not dramatically, but enough. Entries connected. Voicemail aligned with financial activity. Potential camera coverage aligned with stated locations. Nothing exaggerated, nothing forced, just consistent. And consistency over time became difficult to dismiss. Jameson believed that what mattered was what he could control in the moment. The conversation, the narrative, the impression he left behind. He did not consider what happened after. When moments were placed side by side, when words were measured against action, when timing, something he treated as flexible, became fixed. Isla did, not because she anticipated every detail, but because she understood the value of alignment, of placing one fact next to another until they formed something that no longer required explanation. The voicemail had not changed anything fundamentally. It had not introduced a new direction. It had simply clarified one thing: Jameson's belief. That silence meant inaction. That composure meant limitation. That the absence of conflict meant the absence of consequence. He had spoken those beliefs out loud, without hesitation, without awareness that they were being recorded. Now they existed outside of him, no longer adjustable, no longer dependent on his version of events. Just another piece, placed within a structure that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Jameson chose Sunday afternoon, not the evening when things might feel formal, not late at night when emotion could be dismissed as impulsive. Afternoon suggested reason, suggested space for conversation. He stood at the front door of the house he still referred to in his mind as his. For a moment, he didn't knock. He adjusted his jacket, ran a hand once through his hair, then pressed the bell. Inside, Isla heard it. She didn't move immediately. She finished what she was doing first, closing a document on her laptop, saving it, placing the device gently on the table. Then she stood and walked to the door. Not slowly, not quickly, just without urgency. When she opened it, Jameson was already mid-breath preparing to speak. He stopped, not because he had changed his mind, because her expression gave him nothing to respond to. "Can we talk?" he asked. Isla considered the question, not the words, the structure. "We can," she said. She did not step aside. She did not invite him in. Jameson glanced past her briefly, as if expecting the house to rearrange itself in his absence. It hadn't. He shifted his weight slightly. "I'd prefer to do this inside." Isla held the door where it was. "We can talk here," she said. The boundary was clear, not aggressive, just placed. Jameson exhaled, then nodded once. "Fine." There was a brief silence. Not uncomfortable, just unfilled. "I think things got out of hand the other night," he began. Isla didn't respond. He continued. "I didn't handle it the right way," he said. "I should have explained things better." "Explained." The word lingered. Isla watched him without interruption. Jameson shifted again, adjusting his tone. "I never wanted to hurt you," he added. "That wasn't the intention." Isla spoke then. "What was the intention?" she asked. The question did not carry accusation. It required definition. Jameson paused. "Things changed," he said. "Gradually. It wasn't something I planned." Isla nodded slightly. "Over what period?" she asked. He frowned. "What the change?" she clarified. "Over what period did it occur?" Jameson looked at her irritation flickering briefly. "Does that really matter?" he asked. "It does," Isla said. "Not louder, not sharper, just consistent." He exhaled again. "A few months," he said. Isla didn't correct him. She didn't reference the timeline she had already built. She simply asked, "And during those months, did you continue to use the joint account?" Jameson's expression tightened. "This isn't about money," he said. "It includes it," Isla replied. He ran a hand over his face. "I'm trying to have a real conversation with you," he said. "Not go through a checklist." "This is the conversation," Isla said. The difference between them sat clearly in that moment. Jameson spoke in direction, Isla spoke in structure. "I made a mistake," he said, adjusting again. "I can admit that. But we don't have to turn this into something Legal. The word came out with hesitation, as if naming it might make it more real. Isla's gaze didn't shift. It already is, she said. Jameson shook his head. Only if you make it that way. Isla considered that. Then she asked, "Are you still listed as my spouse on the insurance policy?" The question landed the same way it had before. Not new, but unchanged. Jameson let out a short, frustrated breath. "Yes," he said, "because we haven't filed anything yet." "So legally nothing has changed," Isla said. He didn't answer, because the answer was already in the question. Jameson stepped slightly closer, lowering his voice. "This doesn't have to be adversarial," he said. "We can figure this out between us." Isla did not step back, but she did not close the distance either. "What does figure it out mean?" she asked. Jameson hesitated. "It means we don't involve lawyers," he said. "We don't make this bigger than it needs to be." Isla nodded once. "And the house?" she asked. Jameson straightened slightly. "We can come to an agreement." "What agreement?" Isla asked. He paused again. "Something fair," he said. Isla watched him. "Defined, how?" she asked. Jameson's patience began to thin. "Isla, you know what I mean," he said. "No," she replied. "I don't." The words were not confrontational. They were exact. Jameson looked at her, searching for something emotion-resistance, anything that would allow him to redirect the conversation. He found none. "I'm trying to be reasonable," he said. Isla didn't challenge that. She asked, "Are you currently supporting Lila financially?" The question shifted the frame. Jameson's jaw tightened. "That's not your concern. It intersects with shared accounts," Isla said. He let out a short laugh, sharper this time. "You've already decided what this is," he said. "There's no point pretending otherwise." Isla held his gaze. "Yes," she said. The word settled differently than he expected. Not as accusation, as acknowledgement. Jameson exhaled slowly, his posture shifting again. "Look," he said softer now. "I know you. I know how you handle things. You don't escalate. You don't drag things through courts." Isla did not respond immediately, because she recognized the statement. Not from this moment. From something else. A recording. She let the silence hold for a second longer than necessary. Then she said, "From this point forward, all communication should be directed through Daniel Reeves." Jameson blinked. "What, my attorney?" she clarified. "I know who he is," Jameson said quickly. "That's exactly what I'm trying to avoid." Isla didn't adjust. "I'm not available for informal negotiation," she said. The phrasing was deliberate, professional, removed from anything that could be reframed as emotional. Jameson stared at her. "You're serious," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Isla replied. Another silence followed. This one different. Less open, more final. Jameson looked past her again toward the interior of the house. "You're really going to do this," he said. Isla did not follow his gaze. "Yes," she said again. He shook his head, stepping back slightly. "This isn't you," he said. Isla considered that. Then she replied, "This is documentation." The distinction did not require explanation. Jameson understood enough of it to know he could not argue it away. He looked at her for a moment longer, as if waiting for something to shift, for her tone to soften, for the door to open wider. It didn't. Finally, he exhaled and turned away. "This is a mistake," he said, not looking back. Isla did not respond. She stood where she was holding the door until he reached the end of the walkway. Only then did she close it. The sound was quiet, not abrupt, not final in the way doors sometimes are when they are meant to signal an ending. Just complete. Inside the house remained unchanged. Outside, Jameson walked to his car with the same confidence he had carried for years. But something had shifted. Not in volume, not in appearance, in direction. For the first time, the conversation had moved entirely out of his control. Not because Isla had argued, not because she had raised her voice, but because she had refused to engage in a space where control could be negotiated. She had moved it elsewhere, into structure, into process, into a system that did not respond to tone persuasion or timing chosen for comfort. And once something entered that system, it no longer returned to where it had been. Jameson had come expecting to be heard, to be understood, to be forgiven perhaps in a way that allowed things to remain undefined. He left with something else, a boundary, clear, unyielding, and entirely outside his ability to reshape. Jameson returned on a Wednesday, not in the afternoon this time, not at a reasonable hour that suggested conversation or reconsideration. He came late, the kind of late that carries intention. The street was quiet, most of the neighboring houses already dark. A single porch light across the cul-de-sac cast a steady glow, illuminating just enough of the pavement to define its edges. Jameson parked in front of the house without pulling into the driveway. A small detail, but not accidental. He stepped out of the car, closing the door harder than necessary, the sound cutting briefly through the stillness before fading again. Inside, Isla heard it, not the door, the shift. Some movements did not require sound to be recognized. She set down the book she had been reading and looked toward the front of the house. She did not move immediately. Timing again mattered. The knock came next. Not a request, a statement, firm, repeated. Isla stood, walked to the entryway, paused just before the door, not to prepare, to observe. Then she opened it. Jameson stood there, his expression tighter than before, the controlled tone from their last conversation replaced by something more immediate. "We need to talk," he said. Isla did not step aside. "We've already established the channel for communication," she replied. Jameson exhaled sharply. "I'm not going through your lawyer to get my own things." The phrasing was intentional. Possession, claim. Isla considered him for a moment. "Which items?" she asked. He blinked, caught off guard again by the structure of the question. "My things," he said. "Clothes, documents, whatever I left." Isla nodded slightly. "There is a list," she said. "A list," he repeated. "Yes. Of my belongings?" he asked, disbelief edging into his tone. "Of items identified as yours," Isla clarified. The distinction landed. Jameson let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You made a list." "I organized the contents of the house," Isla said. Again, not defensive, just accurate. Jameson ran a hand through his hair, stepping forward slightly as if proximity might shift the dynamic. "You can't just decide what's mine and what isn't," he said. "I didn't decide," Isla replied. "I referenced documentation." He stopped, because that was the part he could not immediately challenge. Not without knowing what had been referenced. "I'm coming in," he said, attempting to move past her. Isla didn't raise her voice. She didn't step back. She simply held her position. "No," she said. The word was not loud, but it did not move. Jameson stared at her. "You're going to block me from my own house?" he asked. Isla met his gaze. "This is not your residence under current legal conditions," she said. The phrasing was precise. Not personal, not emotional. Legal. Jameson let out a sharp breath, his frustration no longer contained beneath controlled language. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You can't just change the locks and pretend I don't live here." "I did not change them without notice," Isla replied. "You didn't give me notice," he countered. "The notice was formalized," she said. Jameson paused, not because he understood fully, but because he recognized the direction. "You actually filed something," he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Isla replied. The words settled. Jameson looked at her, searching again for something he could push against. You're escalating this for no reason, he said. Isla didn't respond to the accusation. She asked, would you like the list now, or would you prefer it sent through Daniel Jameson? Let out a humorless laugh. I'm standing right here. Isla nodded. Then she stepped back just enough to reach for the folder placed on the small table near the door. She did not invite him inside. She did not need to. She handed the folder to him. Jameson took it, flipping it open with a kind of impatience that assumed it would not hold anything he hadn't already accounted for. The pages inside were organized, typed, categorized. Clothing items, personal electronics, documents. Each entry accompanied by a note. Location, condition, status. Jameson scanned the first page, then the second. His expression shifted. Where's everything else, he asked. Isla did not need to look at the document. It is categorized under shared or separate property, she said. Shared means mine too, he said. Shared requires legal division, Isla replied. And separate, he asked. Documented ownership, she said. Jameson looked back down at the list, flipping another page. This is insane, he said. You've turned my life into a spreadsheet. Isla did not respond. Because that was not what she had done. She had turned it into a record. Jameson closed the folder, his grip tightening slightly around it. You don't get to do this unilaterally, he said. I didn't, Isla replied. I initiated a process. He shook his head. Same thing. It isn't, she said. The distinction held. Behind them, a porch light flicked on across the street. A small movement. A neighbor stepping outside, briefly drawn by the raised voices, not loud enough to be called a scene, but enough to be noticed. Jameson saw it. His posture shifted, awareness returning to the public nature of the space. This doesn't have to happen like this, he said, lowering his voice again. We can still fix it. Isla watched him. What does fix mean, she asked. He hesitated. Adjust, he said. Compromise. On what basis, Isla asked. Jameson's patience thinned again. On the fact that we were married, he said. Isla nodded once. That is part of the documentation, she said. The answer did not move toward resolution. It returned to structure. Jameson exhaled, stepping back this time. Not in retreat, in recalibration. You're really going to lock me out, he said. Isla did not correct the phrasing. Yes, she said. Another silence, longer, less negotiable. Jameson looked at the house again. Not the exterior, the idea of it. The assumption he had carried for years that presence equaled ownership, that familiarity equaled control. Now, standing on the outside of it, that assumption no longer aligned with what he was being told. Or with what he was beginning to understand. I need my documents, he said finally. They are listed, Isla replied. When can I get them? Isla considered. They can be arranged through Daniel, she said. Jameson shook his head. I'm not scheduling my own life through your attorney. Isla did not adjust. Then you may propose an alternative through the same channel, she said. The structure remained. Unchanged. Jameson looked at her for a moment longer. Then without another word, he turned and walked back toward his car. The folder remained in his hand. He did not slam the door this time. He got in, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb with less force than he had arrived with. Across the street, the porch light turned off again. The neighborhood returned to its quiet. Inside, Isla closed the door. The sound was the same as before, not final, but complete. The house did not feel different, because nothing within it had changed. What had changed existed outside, in the recognition that entry was no longer assumed, that access was no longer implied. That volume raised voices. Firm knocks, repeated insistence did not override structure. Jameson had come expecting to assert, to reclaim, to re-establish something he believed could not be removed without his agreement. He left with a list and a process, neither of which responded to how strongly he felt about them, only to what could be shown. And what could be shown now existed in a form that did not bend, not to tone, not to presence, not to insistence. The house, like everything else, had been addressed, not by argument, not by confrontation, but by law. And law did not require permission to be followed. Lila did not call Jameson the next day, not out of anger, not out of strategy, out of something quieter. Distance. It had begun the night of the dinner, continued through the drive, and settled into something more defined in the days that followed. Not a decision, not yet, but a shift. She still went to her appointments, still answered messages from work, still moved through her days with the same outward structure, but internally she had stopped accepting things at face value. That was new. On Thursday morning, she sat in the waiting room of the clinic, one hand resting lightly against the side of her stomach. The space was calm, softly lit, filled with the low murmur of conversations that didn't reach full volume. Across from her, a couple spoke quietly and their heads inclined toward each other in a way that suggested shared understanding. Lila watched them for a moment, then looked away. Her phone rested in her lap. The screen lit briefly with a message. "Jameson, we need to talk." She didn't open it immediately. Instead, she opened something else. Her email. She typed a name into the search bar. Daniel Reeves. The result appeared instantly, not because she had corresponded with him, but because Isla had. The email had been sent to Lila the previous evening. No introduction, no explanation. Just a forwarded message. Attached documents. Subject line unchanged. Lila had stared at it for several minutes before opening it. Now, sitting in the quiet of the waiting room, she tapped it again. The first document loaded. Property agreement. She didn't understand all of it, but she understood enough. Names, dates, structure. The phrase appeared more than once. Separate property. She scrolled. Another document. Bank statements. She recognized the format, not the content. Not until she saw the numbers. Small transfers, consistent. Her account number. Lila's breath caught slightly, not from surprise, from recognition. She hadn't known where the money came from, not exactly. Jameson had described it as taking care of things as if the explanation itself made the source irrelevant. She hadn't asked further. Now, looking at the entries lined up in front of her, she understood that the source had never been neutral. It had always been connected to Isla, to something that was not his, to move freely. Lila closed the document. Not because she had finished, because she needed a moment to separate what she was seeing from what she had been told. Her name was called. She stood, slipping the phone into her bag, and followed the nurse down the hallway. The appointment proceeded as it always did. Measurements, routine questions, reassurances delivered in practiced tones. Lila answered where needed, nodded when expected. But her attention was divided, not by fear, by recalibration. When it was over, she stepped back outside into the late morning light. The air felt cooler than she expected. She walked a few steps away from the entrance before stopping. Then she took her phone out again. This time, she opened Jameson's message. "We need to talk." Below it, another message had arrived. "Don't listen to anything she sends you." Lila stared at the screen. Then slowly, she typed, "I already did." She didn't send it immediately. She read it once, not for tone, for accuracy. Then she pressed send. Jameson called within minutes. She let it ring once, twice. Then she answered. "Lila," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "You can't take that at face value. She's trying to—" "Where did the money come from?" she asked. The question cut through the explanation he had been preparing. There was a brief pause. "What money?" he said. "The transfers," Lila replied. "The account." Jameson exhaled. "It's not what you think." "Then explain it," she said. Her voice was not raised, but it did not move. Jameson hesitated. "Things were complicated," he said. "We hadn't separated accounts yet." "It's normal." "For how long?" Lila asked. How long were you using that account?" she clarified. Jameson's silence answered more than his words would have. Lila looked down at the sidewalk, her fingers tightening slightly around the phone. "You told me it was already done," she said. "It is done," he insisted. "Emotionally, it's been over." "That's not what I asked," she said. The echo of Isla's phrasing did not go unnoticed. Jameson heard it. His tone shifted. "She's getting to you," he said. "No," Lila replied. "I'm reading what's there." Another pause. Longer this time. "Look," Jameson said, adjusting again. "I didn't think it mattered where the money came from. I was handling things, taking care of you." Lila closed her eyes briefly. "Taking care of you?" The phrase landed differently now, not as support, as misdirection. "You didn't tell me the full situation," she said. "I told you what you needed to know," he replied. The words settled, clear, unfiltered. Lila opened her eyes. "That's not the same thing," she said. Jameson exhaled sharply. "You're making this into something bigger than it is." "No," Lila said. "I'm seeing it clearly." The distinction held. Jameson shifted again, his voice tightening. "You think she's being reasonable? Sending you documents like that?" "I think she's being precise," Lila said. The word came without hesitation. Jameson didn't respond immediately, because precision was not something he could argue against in the same way he could argue against emotion. "You're overthinking this," he said finally. Lila shook her head, though he couldn't see it. "No," she said. "I wasn't thinking enough before." The silence that followed was different. Not open, not negotiable. Jameson tried again. "We're having a baby," he said. "That's what matters." Lila's hand moved to her stomach. She felt the weight of it, the reality. "Yes," she said. "And I'm here," he continued. "I'm not going anywhere." The statement was meant to reassure. It didn't. Lila looked down the street at the passing cars, at people moving through their day without awareness of the conversation unfolding in her hand. "You already did," she said. Not accusing, just accurate. Jameson didn't answer, because he couldn't reframe that, not in a way that aligned with everything else. "I need time," Lila said. "For what?" he asked. "To understand what I'm part of," she replied. The words were quiet, but they held. Jameson let out a breath. "There's nothing to understand. It's simple." Lila almost smiled. Not from humor, from recognition. "That's what you said before," she said. Then she ended the call. That evening, she sat in her apartment again. The same space, the same couch, but not the same perspective. The documents lay open on the table in front of her. She didn't reread them. She didn't need to. They had already done what they were meant to do. Not convince, clarify. For the first time since she had stepped into the house, Lila understood her position. Not as the person Jameson had chosen, not as the one he had moved forward with, but as someone placed into a narrative that had been incomplete from the start. She was not the cause of the fracture, but she had been used to justify it. And now, with the structure exposed, she could see the shape of it, where it began, how it had been maintained, what it required to continue. She leaned back slowly, her hand resting again over her stomach. The baby shifted. A small, steady reminder of something that did not depend on any of this. Lila exhaled. Not sharply, not with emotion that needed release, just evenly. Across town, Isla did not know what Lila had read, or how she had responded. She didn't need to, because the documents had already been placed. And once something is placed in its correct form, it does not require persuasion to be understood. Only time. And Lila, for the first time, had begun to take that time. To listen, not to what was said, but to what remained when everything else was removed. The filing did not arrive with noise. No announcement, no confrontation, just a document. Delivered through proper channels, time-stamped, recorded, entered into a system that did not pause to consider how anyone felt about it. Jameson received it on a Monday morning. He was at his desk when the email came through, subject line, neutral phrasing, standard attachments clearly labeled. For a moment, he didn't open it. Not because he didn't understand what it was, because he did. And understanding did not make it easier to face. He exhaled, leaned back in his chair, then clicked. The document loaded. Petition for dissolution. He read the first line, then the second, then stopped. Not because he couldn't continue, because the structure of it required him to. He scrolled. Names, dates, jurisdiction, everything placed where it belonged. There was no commentary, no interpretation, only information. He reached the section outlining assets, paused, read more carefully. Property, identified, classified, supported by documentation. The language did not leave room for assumption. The house, not listed as shared in the way he had always described it. Instead, structured, defined. Attached to documentation he vaguely remembered signing but had never fully processed. He scrolled further. Financial disclosures, account numbers, transaction summaries, patterns, not highlighted, not emphasized, but present. He leaned forward, his grip tightening slightly on the edge of the desk. "This is excessive," he said aloud, though no one was there to hear it. The room did not respond, because the document did not require response. It required acknowledgement. Jameson closed the file, then opened it again, as if repetition might change what was written. It didn't. By noon, he had contacted an attorney. Not Daniel Reeves, someone else. Someone who he hoped approached the situation differently, more aggressively, more aligned with how he believed the situation should be handled. He sat across from the man that afternoon, the folder open between them. "I don't understand how she's claiming the house like this," Jameson said. "We bought it together." The attorney, Mr. Keller, did not respond immediately. He read, carefully, not rushing. When he finished the first section, he looked up. "Did you contribute to the initial capital?" he asked. Jameson frowned. "We both paid for it. Did you provide the down payment?" Keller clarified. Jameson hesitated. "Not directly," he said. But that doesn't mean Keller held up a hand, not to stop him, but to structure the conversation. "The source of the initial capital matters," he said, "especially if it was designated as separate property." Jameson leaned back slightly. "That was just paperwork," he said. "It doesn't change the fact that I lived there." Keller did not respond to the statement. Instead, he asked, "Did you review the trust documentation at the time of purchase?" Jameson didn't answer immediately. Not in detail, he admitted. Keller nodded once. Then he returned to the document. "The classification here is consistent," he said. "If the structure was not modified, it remains in effect." Jameson exhaled sharply. "So what, I just walk away? That depends on the full scope of assets and liabilities," Keller replied. He flipped to the next section. "Let's look at the financial disclosures." Jameson watched as the attorney scanned the entries. His expression did not change dramatically, but it did settle. Not in Jameson's favor. "These transfers," Keller said, tapping the page lightly. "Are these accurate?" Jameson glanced at the document. "Yes," he said. But they're not what she's making them out to be. What are they? Keller asked. Support, Jameson said. Personal expenses. Keller nodded. From a joint account, he said. Jameson shifted. Yes, but without formal separation of funds, Keller continued. And without disclosure. Jameson didn't respond, because that was accurate. Keller placed the document down. This is not about narrative, he said. It's about structure. Jameson leaned forward again, frustration rising. She's making it look like I did something wrong, he said. Keller met his gaze. You're not being evaluated on intention, he said. You're being evaluated on documentation. The distinction's settled. Jameson looked away. Across town, Isla received confirmation. Not from Jameson. From Daniel. Filing accepted. Awaiting response. She read the message once, then closed it. There was no need to revisit it. The process had moved forward, as expected. Jameson left the attorney's office with the folder still in his hand. He didn't go home, not immediately. Instead, he sat in his car for several minutes, the document resting on the passenger seat beside him. He stared at it, not reading, not analyzing, just looking. This was not how he had imagined things would unfold, not because he expected forgiveness, but because he expected flexibility, conversation, adjustment. Not structure, not something that moved forward without waiting for his agreement. He picked up his phone, opened his messages, scrolled to Isla's name, typed, stopped, deleted, started again. This isn't how it should be handled. He stared at the sentence, then erased it, because he already knew the response. There would be none. Not here, not anymore. Lila received her own document that week. Not a legal filing, a message. From Daniel Reeves. Clear, professional. Informing her that her name had appeared in financial records connected to the case and that she might be contacted if further clarification was required. She read it slowly. Not because it was complicated, because it confirmed something she had already begun to understand. This was no longer personal, not in the way she had first experienced it. It had moved beyond conversation, beyond explanation, into something that would proceed with or without emotional alignment. She set the phone down. Her hand moved to her stomach again. The same grounding motion. But now, it carried something else. Recognition. That whatever choices she made next would not exist in isolation. They would exist within a structure already in motion. The collapse did not happen all at once. There was no single moment where everything gave way. No visible break. Instead, it occurred in stages. Quiet, measured, each piece aligning with the next. Jameson's narrative, built on assumption, on confidence, on the belief that things would remain flexible, met something that did not adjust. Not because it resisted him, because it was not designed to respond to him at all. Documents did not negotiate, records did not reconsider. They held, and when placed together, they formed something that did not require interpretation to be understood. Jameson had believed that what mattered was what could be said. What could be explained? What could be reframed in conversation? Now sitting in his car with a document that did none of those things, he began to understand the difference between speaking and being recorded, between assuming and being defined. Across town, Isla did not observe the collapse. She did not watch it unfold. She did not track his reactions, because she did not need to. The process was not dependent on his awareness, only on its own progression, step by step, entry by entry, until what had once been held together by assumption no longer had anything left to stand on. And when that happened, it did not fall loudly. It simply stopped holding. The conference room did not belong to either of them. That was the point. Neutral walls, a long table, chairs placed evenly along both sides. No photographs, no personal items, nothing that suggested history. Isla arrived first. She placed her folder on the table, sat down, and aligned her pen beside it. The documents inside were already organized in the order they would be referenced. There would be no searching, no hesitation. Daniel Reeves sat across from her, reviewing his own copy. "Everything is in place," he said quietly. Isla nodded. There was nothing to add. A few minutes later, the door opened. Jameson entered with his attorney, Mr. Keller, following just behind him. His posture was composed, but not as controlled as it had once been. There was a tension in the way he moved, a slight delay in each step that hadn't been there before. He glanced at Isla. She did not look away. There was no hostility in her expression. No acknowledgement beyond recognition. They took their seats, across from each other. The table between them held more than distance. It held structure. Keller opened the meeting. "Let's proceed," he said. "We've reviewed the filing and accompanying documents. We'd like to clarify a few points." Daniel inclined his head slightly. "Of course." The tone remained even. Professional, contained. Keller turned a page in his file. "Regarding the property," he began. "The classification as separate property is central to this case. We want to confirm that there have been no modifications to the original structure since closing." Daniel gestured lightly toward Isla. She spoke. "There have been no modifications," she said. Her voice was steady, unhurried. Keller nodded, making a note. "And the initial capital," he asked. "Provided through a trust established prior to the marriage," Isla replied. "Documented in the closing records." Keller glanced at Jameson briefly, then back to the file. "We've reviewed the documentation," he said. "Our position is that while the initial capital may have been separate, the use of the property over time suggests shared interest." Daniel responded. "Use does not alter classification without formal restructuring," he said. "There is no record of such restructuring." The statement did not escalate. It clarified. Keller did not argue immediately, because the absence of documentation limited the space in which argument could exist. He turned to the next section. "Financial activity," he said. He tapped the page lightly. "These transfers," he continued, "are being presented as misuse of funds. Our client maintains that they were personal expenditures within the context of an ongoing marital relationship." Daniel did not respond immediately. He allowed the statement to settle. Then he said, "The issue is not the existence of personal expenditures. It is the source and structure of the funds used." He gestured toward the document. "The account in question is linked to obligations that had not been formally separated," he continued. "And the expenditures were made without disclosure." Keller looked at Jameson again, then back at Daniel. "Our client disputes the characterization of non-disclosure," he said. Daniel inclined his head slightly. "On what basis?" he asked. Keller paused. Not long, but long enough. Jameson shifted in his seat. "I didn't think it was necessary to explain every expense," he said. His voice entered the conversation for the first time. It carried less certainty than it had before. Isla listened. She did not interrupt. Daniel turned slightly toward Jameson. "Did you inform Isla of the transfers?" he asked. Jameson hesitated. "No," he said. The answer remained in the room. Not emphasized, not repeated, just present. Keller adjusted his posture. "We're not here to litigate every transaction," he said. "We're here to reach a resolution." Daniel nodded. "As are we," he said. The conversation moved forward, point by point, asset by asset. Each item addressed in turn, not quickly, but efficiently. There were no raised voices, no sudden shifts in tone, only a steady progression through the structure that had already been established. At one point, Keller introduced the possibility of a negotiated adjustment, a settlement that acknowledges both parties' contributions, he said. Daniel turned to Isla, not to prompt, to confirm. She spoke. Contributions are documented, she said. The sentence did not reject negotiation. It defined its limits. Keller exhaled slowly. He understood. Without documentation to support an alternative structure, the scope of negotiation narrowed. Jameson watched the exchange. Not fully engaged, but not detached either. He followed enough to recognize what was happening, not in a single moment, but across the accumulation of them. Each time a point was raised, it returned to the same place. Documentation. Each time he attempted to reframe something through explanation, it met the same response. Structure. There was no space for improvisation, no room for persuasion, only alignment, or the absence of it. Near the end of the meeting, Keller set his pen down. "We can continue to extend this process," he said, "or we can move toward finalization based on the current structure." He looked at Jameson. The decision did not belong entirely to him, but it required his acknowledgement. Jameson did not respond immediately. He looked at the documents in front of him, then at Isla. She met his gaze. Not with expectation, not with pressure, just presence. For a moment, the room held something that was not written. History, time, everything that had existed before the documents. But it did not override them. It did not alter them. It simply existed alongside. Then Jameson looked away. "Proceed," he said. The word was quiet, but it carried. Keller nodded once. Daniel made a note. The meeting concluded shortly after. No one stood abruptly. No one lingered unnecessarily. Papers were gathered, folders closed, chairs moved back into place. Jameson remained seated for a moment longer than the others, not because he had something to say, because there was nothing left to say that would change what had already been established. Isla stood. She did not look back as she moved toward the door, not out of dismissal, out of completion. The hallway outside was quiet, the building unchanged. The world beyond the room continued without interruption. Jameson exited last. The door closed behind him with the same soft finality it had for everyone else. No louder, no different, because the significance of what had occurred did not depend on how it sounded, only on what had been decided. And what had been decided did not require repetition. It would continue, through process, through filing, through completion, until there was nothing left to resolve, only what remained. The final documents arrived without ceremony. No envelope marked urgent, no call to confirm receipt, just an email. Attachments labeled clearly, signatures already placed where they needed to be. Isla opened them in the morning. Not immediately. She finished her coffee first. Let the house settle into the quiet rhythm it had carried since everything began to shift. The same light came through the windows. The same stillness filled the rooms. Nothing about the space reflected what had changed. And yet everything had. She moved to the table, sat down, and opened the first file. Her eyes moved over the pages with the same precision they had carried from the beginning. Names, dates, terms. No surprises. No revisions that required reconsideration. The structure had held, exactly as it was built. She reached the final page. Her signature appeared beside the others. Complete, not emphasized, just placed. Isla closed the document. Then she closed the laptop. There was no pause for reflection. No moment where she allowed the weight of it to settle into something emotional. Because the weight had already been processed, piece by piece, document by document. Long before this point, what remained now was not resolution. It was conclusion. The house was quiet. It had been for weeks. Not empty, but different. Not because someone had left, but because something had been removed. Expectation, assumption. The quiet tension that had once existed in the spaces between conversations. It no longer had anything to attach itself to. Isla stood moving through the rooms without intention to check or confirm anything. Everything was already in place. The living room remained unchanged. The same books, the same arrangement, but the air felt clearer, not lighter, just unburdened. She paused briefly near the window, looking out toward the street. The neighborhood had returned fully to itself. Cars passing, neighbors walking their dogs, routine continuing without interruption. Nothing in the outside world marked what had happened inside this house. And that was appropriate. Because what had ended here did not require recognition, only completion. In another part of the city, Jameson signed his copy later that afternoon. He did not sit at a table. He stood, the document spread across the counter of an apartment that still felt temporary, no matter how long he had been there. He read less than he should have, not because he didn't care, because he already understood the outcome. There was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to reshape, only acknowledgement. He signed. The pen moved steadily, not with hesitation, but without conviction. The signature looked the same as it always had, clean, confident. It did not reflect what had changed. He placed the pen down, folded the document once, then unfolded it again, as if the action itself might shift something. It didn't. He exhaled. The room remained the same. The silence did not adjust to him. Lila received no documents, only distance. Jameson's messages had slowed, then stopped. Not entirely, but enough. She had not responded to the last one, not out of intention, out of clarity. Her days continued in a different rhythm now. Appointments, preparation, decisions that did not include him in the same way. She did not define the change. She did not need to. It existed, without explanation. Back in the house, Isla returned to the study. The same room, the same desk. She opened the filing cabinet, not to review, to conclude. She placed the final documents into a new folder, labeled it, not with a date, with a word, closed. She slid it into place among the others, aligned, consistent, part of a system that did not prioritize emotion, only record. She closed the drawer. The sound was quiet, contained. Later that evening, she packed a small suitcase, not hurried, not as a reaction, as a decision. The house would remain. But she would not because she'd been removed, because she had no reason to stay. Everything that had anchored her there had already been resolved. She moved through the rooms one last time, not to say goodbye, to confirm that nothing required her attention, nothing remained unfinished. At the door, she paused, not out of hesitation, out of recognition. This had been a place of structure, of documentation, of quiet observation. It had served its purpose. She opened the door, stepped outside, closed it behind her. The sound was the same as every other time, not louder, not softer, just complete. There was no audience, no one watching, no one marking the moment. The street remained unchanged. The evening light settled across the houses in the same way it always had. Isla walked to her car, placed the suitcase in the back, then sat behind the wheel. She did not start the engine immediately, not because she was uncertain, because there was no need to rush. She looked once more at the house, not with attachment, not with regret, just acknowledgement. It had been part of a structure. Now it was part of a record. She turned the key. The engine started. She pulled away from the curb. The house remained where it was, unchanged, occupied by its own stillness. The story did not end with confrontation. No final words exchanged. No moment where everything was said. Because nothing needed to be said. Everything had already been documented. Everything had already been understood. Jameson had expected reaction, emotion, something he could respond to. Isla had given him none of that. Not because she lacked it, because she did not rely on it. She had moved through the process with precision, with consistency, with a kind of quiet that did not ask to be recognized, only to be effective. In the end, there was no victory, no visible triumph, only alignment between what had happened and what could be shown, between what had been assumed and what had been defined. Isla did not leave with more than she came with. She left with exactly what had always been hers, and without anything that had never truly belonged. The difference was no longer hidden, no longer subject to interpretation. It existed, clearly, in the absence of everything that had once tried to obscure it. And that clarity did not need a final word. It held on its own. In some stories, the loudest moments are the ones people remember, the arguments, the confrontations, the final declarations that leave no room for doubt. But there are other stories, quieter ones, where nothing is shouted, and yet everything changes. Where a person does not fight to be heard, but chooses instead to be precise, to observe, to document, to wait until the truth no longer needs defense. Isla never needed to prove who she was through words. She let the structure speak, let the records hold, let the process move forward without interruption. And when it was done, she did not stay to witness the aftermath. She left, not because she lost something, but because she no longer needed to remain where something had already ended. If you've ever believed that strength has to be loud to be real, maybe this story asks something different. Maybe it asks whether clarity is stronger than reaction, whether patience can be more decisive than confrontation, whether walking away without the last word is sometimes the clearest answer. If this story stayed with you, you can let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if you believe that dignity doesn't need permission to exist, you're welcome to stay. Follow along and see what other stories unfold the same way, quietly but completely.